Okay, welcome back. This is part two of our discussion of leadership. We've reviewed these learning objectives before, so I'll just blow past them. We're going to address the bottom two, number 2 and number 3, in this discussion now. First, we're going to talk about behavior models of leadership in essence, and make the case that right from the outset that there are different ways that leaders can interact with those who work with them in order to influence them. And so two basic types of behaviors that are used to influence. One is what the behavioral models call consideration. And I have argued those are sort of the people-oriented behavior. So behavior that indicates that a manager trusts, respects, and cares about subordinates. It's the interpersonal relationship that exists between the leader and the subordinate, the leader and the employee. There's also this awkward term called initiating structure. Now keep in mind, some of these theories were developed years ago, and so consideration and initiating structure are the terms that were used. Initiating structure really means more of a process-oriented focus in the way the leader influences the behavior of subordinates, and it means behavior that managers engage in to ensure that work gets done, that subordinates perform their jobs acceptably, and that the organization is efficient and effective. And again, that is a little of what we talked about before, which is setting standards, establishing processes, holding people accountable for following procedures and processes. Let's go now to a discussion of contingency models of leadership. And the key here is this idea of contingency models. What is the model of leadership contingent upon? And we'll discuss all of that. So contingency models, in essence, argue that leader effectiveness is the result of the interplay between what the manager does, what they attempt to do in terms of influencing the behavior of their subordinates, and the situation itself. Sometimes that situation is defined by the capability of the employee. Sometimes it's defined by other things about the clarity of the job and the tasks that are being performed. Depends on the theory, and we're going to now review those and talk about them. So, in essence, what comes up again is this idea that there's a relationship-oriented style. Leaders are concerned with developing good relationships with their subordinates and want to be liked by them. And then there's the task-oriented style, where a leader is primarily concerned in making sure the subordinate does the work at a high level and focuses on task accomplishment. Some leaders blend those two things. Some tend to align with one or the other, and that's the point of this discussion, is to talk about what works and what doesn't work, and when. The three theories that we're going to review are Fiedler, House, and Goleman. Now, Fiedler and House are psychologists who have developed theories that have been taught as part of leadership theory for decades. And as I've mentioned, Goleman is a little different in that he has taken some ideas of others and repackaged them a bit into and done some applied research and introduced them within the context of a discussion of emotional intelligence and what it means to leadership. But I think all three are interesting, and in some ways the simpler version of all of it is the Goleman version, and therefore it makes for a useful toolkit once you graduate. So let's talk first about Fiedler's model. Again, this is an old model for leadership. In essence, what he argues is that the personal characteristics can influence leader effectiveness. So the leader has certain characteristics that when those are brought to bear in a particular situation, those characteristics themselves could determine whether the leader is successful or not. So the manager's characteristic approach to leadership is that manager's leadership style. So in Fiedler's worldview, people have a particular leadership style. So using the framework from the last slide, it could be that their leadership style is to be very relationship-oriented. It could be that their leadership style is to be very task-oriented. It would just depend. Now, if we were to talk about some famous leaders of old, I think you might be surprised, unless you've studied it and read about it, to find out that Stephen Jobs, who is this remarkably admired leader, was not a relationship-based leader at all. He was very task-oriented, and kind of it was viewed as very gruff and rough and hard on his employees and very indifferent to them, but was so task-oriented and so committed to what he was trying to do that people followed him because of sort of the magic of being part of that story. But then you could look at someone else, someone more like Walt Disney, who was also very task-oriented, but he was also very relationship-oriented as well, built strong, enduring relationships with people, and was able to get them to follow him enthusiastically because of the personal relationships that he had with them. And the list goes on. We could all come up with many, many examples of people who have been very, very successful with a relationship-oriented style that they use throughout their life, and others who are successful with a task-oriented style. What Fiedler believes is that an individual's leadership style can't be changed. And this is extremely important because he argues the leader must change the circumstances to fit his or her style. So, there was an entire body of research for years and a lot of human resource management activity that has aligned itself with this way of thinking. And if you think about it, a lot of people talk about particular CEOs being a turnaround CEO, meaning they can come into an organization, they can whip it into shape, they can get cost under control, they can participate in rationalizing or reducing units and turn the thing around. They're very task-oriented. It hasn't got anything to do with the people there. It's very impersonal, and that's the way they operate. That's the way they operate no matter where they are. And if someone makes the mistake of pulling them out and putting them into a model or a situation where they're supposed to be something other than that, other than task-oriented, they're not going to be successful with it. And then others have said, effective leaders can change their style. So, it's still up for debate whether that's true or not. But according to Fiedler, his argument is, at its core, it is really the personality of the individual, the personal characteristics of that individual that determine their style. And therefore, they are really not in control of changing it to any great degree. I mean, they can avoid being rude, but they are not going to be able to change their fundamental focus on whether they're super interested in people and relationships or whether they're more interested in tasks. So in Fiedler's model, he argues that the characteristics of the situation then will determine which leadership style, relationship or task-oriented, is best. And again, keep in mind, Fiedler says you can't change your style. So what he's using here is a model to say what kind of leader should be placed in that situation. Not what style a leader should employ, because he would argue they can't change it. He's saying choose the leader that fits the situation. So the three dimensions that then determine whether the situation as described, the leader-member relations is a way of describing how much the workers like and trust their leader. Is it a really good relationship between them? And he classifies it as good or poor. The second dimension or characteristic of the situation is task structure. That's the extent to which workers' tasks are clear-cut. Is it ambiguous what has to be done, or is it clear-cut? Do they know what needs to be accomplished and how to do it? In some jobs, some types of jobs, things are ambiguous, and it requires that everyone sort of struggle through that ambiguity and figure things out and be willing to change and adapt and experiment. And so he describes it as high as clear-cut or low as in not clear-cut. And then there's position power. It's very much tied to what we talked about before, the sources of power. And it refers to the amount of legitimate, reward, and coercive power leaders have by virtue of their position. Are they very strong in terms of their position power, or are they weak in terms of their position power? And weak might be Someone who's weak in terms of position power might be someone who is sort of like a supervisor or a group leader of a project. And in essence, they don't have any budget control other than what budget is provided for the project. They don't have the ability to make rewards or adjust salaries or any of that, but they're there to lead the team. They're there to lead the team, but they don't have any position power, reward really, or coercive in terms of the ability to actually punish. Now, if you take all of those possible combinations and just breathe deeply and don't get overwhelmed by this diagram, what you can see is on the left side, even though it's not separated like it should be, it's leader-member relations as the first characteristic of the situation, task structure as the second characteristic of the situation, and position power as the third characteristic of the situation. And then as you read from left to right, certainly with leader-member relations, we said before, you classify them as good or poor. So think of this as like an organization chart or a fishbone diagram of sorts, if we turned it on its side. And then when leader-member relations are good, then it could be that task structure is high or low. If leader-member relations are poor, it could be that task structure is high or low. Those are the possible combinations. And then if you try to map position power into this, you've got to look at position power. It's strong or weak, strong, weak, strong, weak, strong, weak, depending on whether it's mapping into high or low task structure and good or poor leader-member relations. Now, if you look down below all the color at the thing with the arrow at the bottom, what Fiedler argues is that those things to the left, the boxes that are described as 1, 2, 3, and 4, tend to be very favorable situations for leaders, and that meaning the relationship with the subordinates is good, the task structure is either high or low, the position power is high or low, but the bottom line is the leaders and the members like each other. The things that are unfavorable is when they have a poor relationship and don't necessarily like each other. What he argues is summarized down in the bottom in blue shading, and that is relationship-oriented leaders are most effective in moderately favorable situations for leading. 4, 5, 6, and 7. So you can see 4, 5, 6, and 7 are when there's good relationship but low task structure and weak position power, and then also all of those situations where the relationships are poor except the very last one, which is poor relations, low structure, and weak position power. So his argument is that those are the ones that are best for a relationship-oriented leader. You might ask yourself, why would that be the case? Well, it's because at this point, the primary thing that needs to happen is to get the relationships back into good shape. That's part of the argument there. The task-oriented leaders are more effective in very favorable situations, 1, 2, and 3. So, if they have good relationships, if they have a good relationship between them, they don't have to work on things as a relationship-based leadership style. It can be more task-oriented. It can be more focused on the work at hand. If it's very unfavorable, it also makes sense for it to be task-oriented. It's a little bit like saying, why waste time on relationship building when the situation is so poor and we need to work so hard? Just be directive, explain what has to be done, and stay on top of things to make sure it gets done. So, whether you like this theory, feel strongly about it or not, what are the key takeaways? The key takeaways are, Fiedler does not believe that leaders can adapt their style to a situation. He believes their style is a permanent characteristic of their personality and their values. He argues that individuals should be placed in situations where they'll be successful, and he then defines those situations and the conditions associated with them based on the relationship between the leader and the member, the degree to which the tasks are structured and clear, and the amount of power held by the leader. and then the conclusion from this is very favorable leadership situations where everybody's getting along. It can be task focused. Very poor situations and confusing situations and poor situations where there may need to be more relationship building. And then when it's just off the rails poor at the end, just go back to tasks and direction. So that's the Fiedler contingency theory of leadership. Now, the House path goal theory of leadership is also a contingency model of leadership. The difference is, and this is a huge difference, it assumes that leaders can change their style to fit the situation. The argument is their role is to help motivate employees so they will work effectively. So this idea of path goal is to help them understand the goal and understand the path that leads to that goal so that they will be satisfied and motivated with the work that they do. That's the sort of the underlying explanation of the title of the theory. So the idea is to clearly identify the outcomes workers are trying to obtain from their jobs, to clearly understand all of that, and reward workers for higher performance and goal attainment with the outcomes that they desire. So if the outcomes they want are pay raises or bonuses, then tie high performance to that. If the outcomes they want are to be able to kick off early and go home, then reward them with that. If the outcomes they want are more challenging work or more autonomy in their jobs or more flexibility, then reward them with that. Again, this is tied to the idea of motivation and those motivation theories. And what is it that motivates them in their job? And the goal is for the leader to help establish that. Clarify the path to attainment of the goals, remove any obstacles to performance, and express confidence in the worker's ability. So a lot of people approach leadership and management with this kind of philosophy, and that is, how do we go about creating a situation that allows this particular employee to work in an environment where they feel satisfied and rewarded, and to give them the intangible rewards that they value. It could be that what they want is a private office because they need quiet. Again, it could be they want to leave early for personal reasons. It could be they want to be in charge of a project and they're aspiring to get to the point where they're in charge of a project. So in the House path goal theory, leaders then should modify their behaviors, their style, to fit the needs of the specific employee. So the contingency is the needs of that employee. And the needs of the employee are sort of defined by this idea of locus of control and the experience that they have and the abilities that they have, and also the degree of what motivates them, and also the situation itself. Some of the behaviors that leaders could exhibit would be directive, path goal clarifying behaviors, and that is sort of setting goals, assigning tasks, showing how to do things, and that might be the appropriate way to interact with employees when conditions are somewhat ambiguous, and you have to show them how things are to be done, explain and clarify how things are to be done. Supportive behaviors are the second category of behaviors that he argues for, and that's looking out for what's in the worker's best interest. So, for example, if they're in a very stressful situation or potentially dangerous situation, it is stepping in and ensuring that something is done for them. And, again, I've seen this happen in a place of employment that I've watched, and that is, when someone was clearly so committed to a particular job that they were not getting enough rest. They were coming in, working long hours, working extra hours. Part of it was because it was a new job for them. Part of it was because they were super, super excited about it, loved it, were enjoying it, but they were going to burn out if they didn't get some rest. And in that kind of situation, the supervisor, the manager stepped in and said, you're doing an absolutely great job, but you're going to burn out if you don't rest. You need to get some sleep. There's also an episode of Parks and Recreation that deals with that subject. You may have watched it at one point. It's a really good example. I wish I had a clip of it to show. Then there's participative behavior, and that is when subordinates are allowed to have say in what's going on in their jobs. And of course, that makes all the sense in the world. And you would do that because they care about it and they want to be involved in things. Makes all the sense in the world. And then finally, achievement-oriented behavior. And that is setting very challenging goals and then basically getting out of the way, believing in the worker's abilities to take it and run with it. And so, you would interact with your subordinates in that fashion when they need autonomy. So if it's a design team, an engineering team, something like that, the supervisor does not need to be, the leader does not need to be right in the middle of all of that. They just sort of set important goals and try to remove all of the obstacles in front of that team and let them run with it. So again, this is House's path goal theory. These behaviors pertain specifically to the relationship between the employee and the leader. Not the relationship, I shouldn't say, but the behavior that the leader uses toward the employee. Okay, now we're going to move into our next type of contingency model of leadership. So we discussed the Fiedler model, and when we talked about Fiedler, we said that Fiedler argues that different leadership styles are better suited to certain circumstances. He believes in a contingency model, that a certain style is needed to match a certain situation or circumstance. But again, the primary difference with Fiedler is he does not believe the individual can change their style. He believes the individual needs to be placed in a situation where their style fits the circumstances. Now, the House model instead argued that the leader is perfectly capable of adjusting their style and exhibiting different behaviors toward different employees, depending on what that employee needs, what motivates them, what kind of direction they might need in doing their job. Goleman is different. Goleman's arguments about this contingency model of leadership argue that certainly an individual leader can adjust their style, but it's less about an individual that they're leading and what that individual's motivations are and capabilities and the particular work that they do. Instead, what Goleman argues is that leadership is contingent upon the circumstances that the organization is facing right then, the particular task that needs to be accomplished. And so he argues that there are 6 styles and that the most effective leaders can move fluidly from one style to the next, not in a way that looks like they have major mood swings and that sort of thing, but it's just a way of fitting their style to the circumstances at hand. And let me move through these to show you what we're talking about. So his 6 styles, one is coercive. The phrase that he uses to describe that is just basically do as I say. So we might call it coercive. We could call it directive. Some interpretations of his work call it directive. But the idea is that you're in essence telling someone what to do, ordering them to do it, or giving them very explicit, urgent instruction about what needs to be done. In essence, you're deciding for them what needs to be done, when, and how. Well, this directive or coercive sort of model, he would argue, should only be used in a crisis, or when there's a need for immediate compliance, when you have a situation where someone has made a mistake and there is a problem that needs to be fixed. It could well be that the leader, the manager, must step in and say, okay, this is how we're going to handle this. I need for you to do X, Y, Z, and do it now. That certainly can happen. But the coercive model or directive model is one that is only used when it's that kind of circumstance. He would argue the leader should not be interacting with employees and directing them what to do on a day-to-day basis because they need to learn and they need to be able to have some autonomy in how they approach work, and they need to be well trained enough that you don't have to get in there and micromanage everything that they're doing. So the directive or coercive approach is one that is associated with getting something done right then. The authoritative approach to leadership, this style of leadership, is more about bringing about change and trying to initiate change. It's more of a come with me model. And in this, it's about establishing a vision, and then through understanding of the people in the organization, trying to get commitment to make that change. So this authoritative style is associated with more of the sort of the big picture planning activities of an organization, the change activities of an organization, and inspiring the employees to come on board and participate in this change. Now, this authoritative leadership style, if you think about it, that sounds very similar, doesn't it, to the leadership characteristics we identified last time, and how that compares to what we might view as more managerial behavior. So again, there's some themes that repeat through all of this. So it's clear that these differences in behavior are observed in effective leaders. The only issue with all these theories that we're talking about and all of these research papers that have been written about it is sort of how you go about describing it, and to what degree can you modify your own behavior to accomplish it. Here's the third type of leadership style. It's called the affiliative style. Now, the phrase to describe this is sort of people come first. People come first before, really, in some ways, the work of the organization. Now, some people might hear that and say, well, an organization that sort of takes that position is not going to be high performing in the long run. Other people might look at it and say, well, actually, if you do that, if you recruit the best people and you make them happy, then that is likely to be the way you are able to be successful. And there are differences of opinion on that out there in the world. Different organizations subscribe to different philosophies. But let me give you some examples of how you could reconcile the affiliative, the authoritative, and the directive styles all in the same organization, even within the same day. So, for example, you could imagine that an organization is trying to go through some major change activity as part of what goes on, and the leader is in the process of, as he meets or she meets with each individual in the organization during the day, just interactions during the day, constantly hammering the importance of this new vision they have and how we're all in this together to make this happen, to improve the quality of our product, to improve the quality of our service to our customers. We want to be the number one company in our market segment. We really want to be successful, and you're part of the team, and that kind of thing, that come with me idea. There could be a quality problem or a safety issue in the middle of all of that, in which case the leader would have to very fluidly turn to more of a directive, coercive model to handle it, get it done. And then, an hour later, be in a situation where they find out that an employee has a family member that's quite ill and is going to suddenly need to be out of work for a period of time, at which point it could be, extraordinary actions taken to make it easy for that employee to be out and to take care of whatever their family concerns are. So that idea of people come first, that we care about our employees, we want to help take care of our employees, we want to make sure they're involved in the communications, that everyone gets along with everyone else, and that there is harmony with the group. So, for example, another example of affiliative might be if you hire a new employee and that new employee is quite negative and is someone that is on the verge of turning the culture in a way that is quite bad. I can honestly say that Jack Welch, some of you may know who I'm talking about. He's been gone for a long time from industry, but he was the extraordinarily well-known leader of General Electric and was viewed as one of the most successful in practicing sort of the core principles of management. And he is one of these people that said that he would let a high performer go if they did not fit the culture. Now, I'm not suggesting that the culture he was trying to create was necessarily an affiliative one, but the point of it is that the human relationships, and how people interact and how they get on board with what the organization is doing in terms of their personality and their interactions with other people. He viewed that as more important than their actual performance. So a surly, gossipy, high performer would be cut loose. Somebody who bought into the culture and was part of this enthusiastic high-performance team but had performance problems, they would give them a chance. They would try to bring them on board. And if you talk to successful leaders, successful managers, they'll reaffirm that over and over again. So you can easily see how a highly effective leader can reconcile these three leadership styles within an hour, certainly within a day. Let's go to the next one. And this is a posture that it can also fit a particular situation. This style is sometimes called democratic, sometimes called collaborative. And it's the idea of what do you think? It's involving the employees in being part of the decision process. And then, again, it's not just asking for their opinion and then making your own. It is asking for their opinion and going along with whatever the consensus of the group is. Highly effective managers are quite good at that. They know that there are just some things that they need to let the employees and other managers, for example, have influence and control over. They want to cultivate, right? They want to cultivate ownership. That's one of the dimensions of conscientiousness, right? We want all employees to be conscientious. Part of conscientiousness is taking ownership of activities and tasks. And so sometimes a democratic model can be appropriate for certain kinds of decisions that need to be made within organizations in order to build collaboration, begin to cultivate team leadership and consensus and ownership and conscientiousness, as we said. So again, this makes sense too, but only if the leader can relinquish the decision. It has to be something that can be relinquished and that they are willing to relinquish. Otherwise, it comes across as a little bit manipulative to ask people for their opinions about things or to give them the impression that they now have the authority to make a decision and to then take it back from them. Pace setting. Pace setting is an interesting kind of leadership style. And according to Goleman and the research that's been done in this, a pace-setting style is one that can be highly effective in the short run, but it can be destructive in the long run. And so let me talk about that. So it's more of a do as I do now kind of model. Think of an engineering group, an R&D group, or a marketing group where the person who is in charge is really one of the members of the team. And so they manage primarily by just really pushing hard all the time. They work themselves to death. And so they are highly conscientious. They have a high drive to achieve. And that can be great if you have a highly motivated team, and it can result in a fast improvement or kind of a turnaround in activities very, very quickly. It's a little bit like having a role model as part of the team that is setting the pace. But the problem with it, again, you have to observe it over time. The problem with it is that people sort of burn out. They can't maintain that high of an energy level. And when someone else is setting the pace, they're having to keep up with that person who is this pace-setting individual. It can result in difficulty over time. So it's just something to be aware of. But a lot of engineering, product development, even marketing teams that are under time pressure, are under pressure to come up with something new quickly, implement it quickly, they're up against a deadline. If you can target that pace-setting activity, that pace-setting leadership style to those circumstances, knowing that once you get past the launch date or past the deadline for the introduction of the new design, then things can settle down a little bit, then that can be a highly effective leadership style. But if you try to sustain it as just the way you do business all the time. It just comes across as kind of frantic, and it wears on the energy and the nerves of the subordinates. Coaching, of course, is logical too, and could be interspersed throughout the day depending on the particular employee. So it's a try this. It's working with an employee to show them what needs to be done, and then stepping back and letting them practice it. So you're trying to develop your team for the future, improve performance, and increase long-term results, and ultimately get to the point where you can delegate. But sometimes what you have to do is sort of coach them, show them, get them to try it, but step back and let them do it. Certainly a coach does not get in the middle of, if you're thinking of an athletic situation, it does not get in the middle of actually running the play. The coach just teaches what might be the appropriate way to approach it. Okay, so what in general can we say we conclude about Goleman leadership styles? One, he argues that leadership styles can be learned, that effective managers and leaders should employ a variety of leadership styles or behaviors tailored to suit the situation. His argument would be that the coercive, demanding, in-charge, directive model is when there's a crisis or when there is an urgent situation that needs to be addressed. He would argue that the coaching, affiliative, and democratic styles are when things are under control and you're focusing on your employees and you want to improve skills, you want to encourage employee involvement, you want to build the team and have them respect and care for each other. The authoritative and even the pace-setting leadership styles are more associated with leading change. The authoritative is leading change toward a long-term vision and sustaining commitment to that vision. Pace setting is more appropriately attached to a sudden burst of activity that may be associated with a more urgent need to change or something that has a deadline attached to it. Let's speak just a minute about the idea of transformational and transactional leadership. Those terms are used a lot in business. And so I just want to make sure that you're familiar with those terms and how they fit in with the conversations we've had so far. So the idea of transformational leadership is just that it's leadership that makes subordinates aware of the importance of their jobs and performance to the organization, and it involves a lot of feedback to the worker, to the employee. It also involves having the leader be aware of the subordinates' needs, what motivates them, understanding them and working with them on personal growth and development. It tends to motivate workers to work for the good of the organization, not just themselves. So when people talk about a transformational leader, they're talking about someone that they have a real personal connection with, somebody who is a personal inspiration to them, someone who helps, who they believe cares for them, and they will. The concept behind transformational is they will transform what they do. They will work differently. They will work better. They will work longer because of the inspiration of that transformational leader. The opposite side of that is a transactional leader, transactional leadership. And that's a leader that basically motivates subordinates by rewarding them for high performance and reprimanding them for low performance. It's very transaction focused. It's very tied into the same kind of ideas that we talked about before as the distinction between leaders and managers. So transactional leaders, which are viewed as sort of on this continuum of transformational, transactional leaders maybe are interacting with employees in much the same way we've described that management posture. And then transformational leaders are more like that leadership posture we talked about before. Now, again, I don't want to suggest that somebody is one or the other of these. The point we're trying to make is these things are a continuum, and anyone has the opportunity to move along that continuum of leader behaviors and manager behaviors, depending on what the circumstances are. There are some cases where someone would be wholly a fish out of water if they were asked to be a transformational leader. And there would be people who would be a fish out of water if they were asked to be a pure transactional leader. It's just not part of what they do. But most people fit along a continuum. Okay, so we have concluded our discussion of leadership, and let's revisit these learning objectives. I want you to be able to explain the relationship between power and leadership, as we discussed in the last slide deck. I want you to be able to explain the contingency models of leadership, including that work of Goleman that is not in your book. So it's Fiedler, House, Goleman. I want you to be able to evaluate the behavior of a leader using the contingency models, which is part of the weekly assignment. So thank you very much, and talk to you again next week.